There we go. Hello, friends. It's taken me a minute to remember how to run things here, but we got it going. Hopefully it should be coming up for you soon. Not a very beautiful transition between slides there, but we got it. We're here. I'm here. Hello, everybody. Hello to you on this beautiful Labor Day evening. There's Allie. Hi, Allie. Yay. Say hey in the chat if you're here and you want to say hi. It's always nice to know who's in the room before we get started. It is Monday, September 7th today, and it's Labor Day. And so I know that this is going to be a day when people are going to have weirder schedules. So we're probably not going to see as many people here tonight as we usually do. But that's okay. It's still going to be a fun time. Oh, hey, Jude. Hi, Carolyn. Yay. Glad to see you. Let's see. I'm noticing right now that I have to shave. 90% of my facial hair grows right here. So I'm noticing in the camera that I got to shave. I apologize for that. I just got back from vacation. A staycation, not a vacation, really. I didn't really go anywhere besides to see a couple of family members who live close by. So I'm back from vacation, and glad to be back. Glad to be seeing you all and talking to you all again. There's Shane and Nikki and Amory and Carson and Mandy. Wow, nice to see you all. I'm so glad you're here. So I got back from vacation, and it got me the whole experience of having a week off, which I realized, I was looking back on my calendar, I haven't had a full week off of no work at all in like 3 years. Because I've done like work trips where I've like gone to cool places while I'm doing work, but I haven't had like a week off of work in a long time. And so it got me thinking a lot about rest, which then got me thinking a lot about work and rest. And because it's Labor Day today, I thought that would be a good thing for us to talk about today, is work and rest and abundance and scarcity, things that kind of come along with those topics in weird ways. So that's what we're going to be talking about tonight. I'm glad y'all are here. So we're going to be reading a text from Mark tonight. I was also looking at recent texts that we've done TMC Bible Studies on, and we've done a lot of Gospels lately. So we got another Gospel text tonight. I'm going to have to balance it out maybe for our next Bible study with a little more Old Testament Hebrew Bible stuff, because that's my jam. You know how that is. But for today, we got another Gospel text, and Gospel texts are always fun to work with. If you weren't with us last time we did a Bible study 2 weeks ago, because we do these every 2 weeks, 2 weeks ago we did a study where we looked at one particular passage through a bunch of different lenses. So like we used like a sort of a literalist or a simple lens. We used a lens of allegory or metaphor to look for those in the text. We talked about one of Luther's lenses, his Law and Gospel lens. So we looked at the text through a lot of different ways. Today, we're not going to be doing a lens-specific thing, but we are going to be reading the text through like 2 times all the way through. The first time, we're going to be looking for connections to other Bible stories. So if you are somebody who knows a lot of Bible stories, you'll have a lot of them for us probably. If you're somebody who's not familiar with a ton of Bible stories, this is a cool moment to kind of go, oh, I had no idea that there were all these weird tie-ins. That's like finding Easter eggs in your movies. So the first time we read through, we're going to find all these little Easter egg moments of ties with other Bible stories. And then the second time through, we're really going to talk more about like how this text relates to us today and our lives and our experiences of rest and work and things like that. So that's the plan for tonight. So I'm glad that you're here. I hope you'll join along with us as we look through this text. I'm going to take a sip of water, and then we are going to look up the text for tonight. So I'll give this to you here. This is tonight's text. Move the camera just a little bit so it's not on that white wall there. There we go. So that's tonight's text, Mark 6, 30 through 46. And you may notice, as soon as you look this up, that the sort of heading or the way that this story is usually chunked up in the chapter is through verse 44. So we're going 2 verses past where the particular story we're reading ends, because it's kind of an important like segue, and I wanted to make sure we included it. So Mark 6, verses 30 through 46. So if you have a Bible on hand, go ahead and grab that. If you don't have one on hand, I will toss this in the chat right now, and then you will have one on hand, because it's the internet. So there's a link. As always, I'm always interested to hear what kind of versions y'all are reading from. King James, English Standard, New Revised Standard. I know somebody was using Young's literal translation. Somebody was using, I'm trying to think of what other translations we've heard of. I think we had a couple people at one point who were looking through the Message. So whatever version of the text you're looking at tonight, we're always interested to know the differences. So I'm going to read through our text tonight, but if you are reading through in a different version and you find a word that seems important, that seems different, always cool to put that in the chat, because then we can see if we can find out why that difference exists. So, as per usual, I'm going to be reading the New Revised Standard Version. That's the version that I usually go with, and so that's what I'm going to be reading tonight. But note your differences. So let's get us started here. Jude says, I truly am out here with the King James. Yeah, I'm not going to King James shame anybody about this. There are certain texts, especially, like certain pieces of scripture, that because if you were somebody who learned it in the King James, you just really want to read it in the King James. Like there's something poetic about it, even though biblical scholars will tell you that it's not the most accurate translation. It's beautiful, and we can't fault it for being beautiful. So I feel you, Jude. So let's get to it. I think what we'll do is I'm going to I think chunk this up into a couple of bits. So I'm not going to read the whole thing all the way through right away. Let's do it in little sections here because it's easier for everybody that way. So I'm going to read verses 30 through 34. So just the first 4 verses. And remember, what we're looking for in this first pass through is where can we find connections to other Bible stories. So there are a whole bunch of Easter eggs, hidden bits in this story that connect to other Bible stories from the Old Testament, from earlier in Mark's Gospel. There's a lot of little things that connect. So if you think like, oh, that phrase sounds familiar, or oh, that reminds me of this other story, that's what we're looking for. So let's read these first 4 verses and see what we can see. So Mark 6, starting in verse 30. The apostles gathered around Jesus and told him all that they had done and taught. Now, hold on, we actually have to stop there for a second, because we're coming in the middle of a story, right? All they had done and taught. This was just after Jesus sent all the disciples out 2 by 2 to go spread the good news, right? So the disciples are supposed to be out teaching and helping people, and now they're coming back to Jesus after they've been out on this big mission. So that's what's going on here. So the apostles gathered around Jesus and told him all that they had done and taught. He said to them, "Come away to a deserted place all by yourselves and rest a while." For many were coming and going, and they had no leisure even to eat. And they went away in a boat to a deserted place by themselves. Now many saw them going and recognized them, and they hurried there on foot from all the towns and arrived ahead of them. As he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion for them, because they were like sheep without a shepherd. And he began to teach them many things. So we're going to pause there for a second. I'm going to pull this out and make it smaller so I can see y'all and the text at the same time. So is there anything in this first bit of the text that reminds you of any other stories? Or any phrase that reminds you of any other stories in the Bible? I'm going to give you a second on that. The first thing that jumps out to me is Jesus saying, come away to a deserted place. I was interested in that phrase because I wasn't really sure what Jesus meant. And I was thinking, like, when else does Jesus go away to deserted places? especially in the Gospel of Mark. And it turns out that Jesus actually does that twice, just in the first chapter of Mark. The first time, it's when Jesus is drawn into the wilderness by the Spirit to be tempted, right? That going to a deserted place, going to the wilderness, that's the same reference that's going on there. So that's the first time Jesus does it. The second time Jesus goes away to a deserted place is also in Mark chapter 1, and it's after his first big miracles. So not to get us off track here with the passage that we're reading, but I'm going to, in Mark chapter 1, I'm going to just read you a couple of verses here. So in the very first chapter of Mark, where we're first learning about Jesus, Jesus goes out and does his first big miracles, and then in verse 35 it says, "In the morning while it was still very dark, Jesus got up and went out to a deserted place, and there he prayed. And Simon and his companions hunted for him. When they found him, they said to him, 'Everyone is searching for you.' And he answered, 'Let us go on to the neighboring town, so I can proclaim the message there also, for this is what I came out to do.'" So Jesus does this thing in Mark quite a bit, where he decides that he's going to go away to a deserted place, or they should go away, the disciples should go away to a deserted place. This idea of like retreating into the wilderness to rest a little bit seems to be a thing that Jesus, it seems to be like part of his whole thing that he does, like part of his routine. It's like you go and you do these big things, like the disciples just went out and did this big thing with all these people, and now he's saying, okay, time to go back to the wilderness area to like rest and sort of replenish your resources. So Jesus does it by himself in Mark 1, and now we see him asking the disciples to do it. So that was kind of a callback there. Carolyn says, the Common English Bible says secluded instead of deserted. And Allie says in Spanish it says a tranquil place. Oh, I love that. I love tranquil place. That's great. Yeah, the deserted place or a wilderness place or a secluded place, all of those things would be accurate to the Greek. Greek words get to mean lots of different things too, and so those would all be accurate. I think one of the difficulties in English is because we read deserted place, I think we automatically think a desert place, like a place that is like sandy and has cactuses, rather than like a place that is without people, right? And that's really what the text is going for here, is a place without all these people, because the disciples have been around people doing these big things, and Jesus is like, let's maybe get a little time to rest and be not in a crowd of people. Jude says, the sheep bit makes me think of the lost sheep. Yeah, so in verse 34, it says, Jesus saw a great crowd and had compassion for them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. Yes, that idea of being a sheep or a lost sheep or sheep without a shepherd, that is a common sort of reoccurring motif in the Bible, right? And it's there's going to be sort of another little touch to that later on in this particular story. But the sheep connection here is kind of interesting, that like looking at the connections to other times in the Bible where people have been called sheep without a shepherd, it's usually when they are being led by a truly bad leader. When there is like a king or an emperor or like bad prophets of Israel, like in the Old Testament, there are some prophets that are not good. In those cases, the people will be called sheep without a shepherd. They don't have somebody to lead them. And so a couple of the commentaries that I was reading on this passage note that when Jesus sees them and he thinks they're like sheep without a shepherd, that could mean a couple different things. It could be in reference to the Herod, who was like in charge at this point, was not a good leader, and so it could have been a little bit of a dig at like the leader of the people. Like they don't have a like. I mean, in the way that many Americans right now feel like we don't really have a president, we're people without a president. That's a bit like what they're kind of going for in this text. The other way that could be connected is that right before this story happens that we're about to read, right before this, John the Baptist is killed. And so there are a bunch of people who had followed John the Baptist and were sort of John's disciples who are literally they're not literally sheep, but they're sort of without their shepherd because John the Baptist has just been killed. So when Jesus says they're like sheep without a shepherd, or thinks they're like sheep without a shepherd, it could be sort of digging in at the leadership at the time, or it could have been saying, like, here are a bunch of people that used to follow John and now they can't follow John anymore, so they're coming to Jesus. So a couple things going on there, but it's definitely a big sheep metaphor connection that happens a lot in the Bible. Okay, so Ali says in the Luther 1545 text, it says desolate place, yep. And then Jude says in the King James, it actually does say desert place, not deserted. Yeah, so Jude, weird, interesting thing about English is that our word desert, which is like the sandy whatever, is it's because of the word deserted, meaning no people. So it's a weird English thing where, like, especially in, like, if you think of a desert island, this is something I learned recently. When people talk about desert islands in, like, older books, they don't mean an island that is a desert with sand and cactuses. They mean an island with no people on it. So English is weird. But in this case, we don't mean necessarily sand and cactuses. We mean there are no people there. But yeah, that's a weird King James thing. Hey, Julia, glad to see you. Today we are talking about the story of Jesus feeding more than 5,000 people in Mark chapter 6. So that's the plan. So we just went through verses 30 through 34, and we're looking for connections to other Bible stories. So let's go on here. We're going to read, should we just read to the end? Let's see. Yeah, let's read to the end here, because I think we've got... Yeah. I think the rest of the connections I want to talk about are in the rest of this passage. So we're going to read now verses 35 through 46. So we're going just a little bit into the next story. 35 through 46. So when it grew late, Jesus has seen all the people. He's seen them coming. He feels compassion for them, even though they're supposed to be in this place with no people. So Jesus is like, well, okay, they're here. So Jesus teaches them. And then, when it grew late, his disciples came and said to him, This is a deserted place, and the hour is now very late. Send them away so that they may go into the surrounding country and villages and buy something for themselves to eat. But he answered them, You give them something to eat. They said to him, Are we to go and buy 200 denarii worth of bread and give it to them to eat? And he said to them, How many loaves have you? Go and see. When they had found out, they said, 5 and 2 fish. Then he ordered them to get all the people to sit down in groups on the green grass. So they sat down in groups of hundreds and of 50s. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and blessed and broke the loaves, and gave them to his disciples to set before the people. And he divided the 2 fish among them. And all ate and were filled. And they took up 12 baskets full of broken pieces and of the fish. Those who had eaten the loaves numbered 5,000 men. Immediately he made his disciples get into the boat and go on ahead to the other side, to Bethsaida, while he dismissed the crowd. After saying farewell to them, he went up on the mountain to pray. So, that's the rest of this fairly short little story. I wonder where you all see connections to other stories here in what we just read. Were there any phrases or any items or images that make you think of other bits of the Bible? Because there's a couple more Easter eggs in here. One thing that I want to bring up, because it connects to what we were talking about before with the sheep, is when Jesus says, let's see, where is it here? He said to them, and then he ordered, verse 39, he ordered them to get all the people to sit down in groups on the green grass. Lots of people have really picked out that green grass thing, and they're like, hey, this is again with the sheep, right? And so they make this connection, between Jesus and the Good Shepherd of Psalm 23, because Jesus sees the people as sheep without a shepherd, and then he tells them to sit down or recline, is another word you'll find here, on the grass, right? And so people think of Psalm 23 and how he leads me beside still waters and makes me to lie down in green pastures, right? So people make that connection to Psalm 23 quite a bit, and it was probable that the author meant to do that, but that's another connection there. Carolyn says, biblical numerology was really popular in my youth group in high school, so the 5 + 2 = 7 sticks out to me, and then the 12 baskets of leftovers. Yeah, so we got a lot of numbers happening in this particular text. So Carolyn, you pulled out a couple of things there. The 5 + 2 = 7, that is an interesting thing because, well, 7 in itself is like sometimes a pretty special number in the Bible, depending, like it shows up a couple of times. So 7 is kind of important, but I think really the most important number part here is the 12 that you caught onto with the 12 baskets of leftovers, right? The 12 baskets could represent as sort of, it could be an analogy or a metaphor for the 12 tribes of Israel and for the 12 disciples, right? So 12 shows up a lot. 12 tribes and 12 disciples are both really important, so then you end up having 12 baskets. So yeah, the 12 shows up quite a bit. I would like to know more. I was looking I was reading these commentaries about this particular story, and they pointed out that in all of the stories about this, feeding miracle that Jesus does in the other Gospels, it's always 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. And they were talking about how it's interesting that it, like why is it that it was that way? Like, why isn't it 5 fish and 2 loaves of bread? Like, what? I don't know. There are questions about like why the numbers are the way that they are. If there was any meaning around it, or maybe there's no meaning around it. We don't know. But it's interesting to think about. So I'm glad you brought that up. What else do people see in this text that connect to other Bible stories? One of the things that would connect to a later Bible story is people make several sort of connections between what goes on in this, what Jesus does in this particular story, and then what Jesus does at the Last Supper, right? Because at the Last Supper, Jesus does the same thing where he holds the bread and he gives thanks and he breaks it and gives it to people, right? So there's kind of a connection there to Jesus and the Last Supper. So that's definitely something that people connect to. And then some people even go further than that, thinking about Jesus as the Eucharist, or as communion, as Holy Communion, Jesus's body. Like, if you ever have been to a church, and this is not something that happens at every church, but usually there are some words that are said when you're given communion at a lot of churches. And so one of the things that you might have said to you is Jesus's body, or Christ's body broken for you. That's like one of the things that sometimes gets said when you're handed the bread. And so people kind of connect that and they go, oh, all of these broken pieces of bread, and this idea of like Jesus's body being given to the people, and like the collection of all the rest of these broken pieces of bread as sort of a sacred act. In the same way that if you've ever been to maybe like a Catholic church that is really careful about the Eucharist and the bread and the wine, to not waste any of it, to not let any crumbs go anywhere, right? So people kind of draw connections between both the Last Supper and communion as practiced by Christian communities today, which is kind of cool. Amory says, Jesus was moved with compassion. Amory, what does that make you think of? Because I know what story that makes me think of, but I'm interested to know what story you're connecting that phrase to. So let us know. Julia says, I think of the fisherman story. Yeah, we talked about the fisherman story a couple weeks ago. What makes you think of the fisherman story, Julia? Because I think obviously there's fish involved in this story, but I think the thing that reminds me of it is this idea of like abundance and like more than you could even ask for. So I wonder if that's what you're thinking of too, but tell us what you think. Amory says the Greek word here for compassion literally means from within his gut or inner parts. The ancient idea of pity, where the ancient idea of pity physically resides. Yes, Amory, that's yes. I think we're on the same line about what other story this seems to connect to. But tell us what other Bible story that makes you think of. Allie says, in Psalm 23, it says that the Good Shepherd will let me rest by green grasses. So here Jesus is the Good Shepherd. Exactly. Yes, you've got the green grass there in verse 39. What a nice image. And there, again, I mean, it shows you that it's not necessarily a desert, sandy desert, right? Like, you could have sand and green grass, but usually, and they are near enough to water that they've been in a boat. So it's, we kind of, this is less of a sandy place and more of a nice hill with no people. Jude says, yeah, the phrasing of get into the ship and go to the other side is what made me think of the fisherman's story. Yeah, yep, okay, so in verse 45, I can definitely see that. Julia says, the miracle, act, and abundance. Yes, so this miracle of abundance is definitely connected to what we talked about a couple of weeks ago with there being so many fish that the nets were breaking, right? Totally. Let's see, what other links might we see here? In verse 46, we see Jesus, it's in verse 46 it says, after saying farewell to them, he went up to the mountain to pray. Jesus is always going up to mountains to pray. So we see that a lot in all of the Gospels where Jesus, like when Jesus goes up on the mountain to pray and then is transfigured in the Transfiguration. That's one example of that. Jesus at the Mount of Olives before his crucifixion is another example of him going up to a mountain to pray. It's a thing Jesus does all the time, so that's another connection to other stories. Carolyn says, the how much bread do you have part kind of reminds me of the parable of the woman who gave her 2 coins, I think if I'm remembering that correctly, in the sense of giving all one has. Yeah, I love that, Carolyn. I hadn't thought of that connection. But yes, this idea of like giving... The fact that you are giving everything, even if it's not enough for the current need, is like, I can definitely see the connection there. Because I'm sure that like when the disciples are going out and they're kind of asking people like, hey, y'all have any food that we can like share around? I'm sure there were people that were like, well, I have 2 loaves of bread, but that's not going to feed 5,000 plus people. So what good is it me giving you my 2 loaves of bread? But then it does good, right? So yeah, I can definitely see that connection it's like less of it's a connection in like the almost the moral aspect of the story. I love that. Allie says, would this have a connection to manna, bread from the heavens? Definitely. Yeah, there are definitely some Christian and Jewish writers who write about this idea of Jesus. Of course, Jesus, says things like, I'm the bread of the world, right? I am the true bread from heaven. He says that all the time. So any sort of connection of like between Jesus and bread is always going to somehow connect to the idea of manna as well. So yeah, definitely a connection there. There's also a connection with the sort of proliferation, the multiplying of bread, to a story of the prophet Elisha. Elisha was one of the more famous prophets in the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible. And Elisha does a similar thing, actually. I've got the verses up here so I can read it. It's like a 2-verse story. So in 2 Kings chapter 4, at the very end of chapter 4, 2 Kings chapter 4 is just Elisha doing a whole bunch of miracles. That's the whole chapter. So at the end of that chapter, it says, a man came from, hold on a second, Baal Shalisha. There we go. Baal Shalisha, bringing food from the first fruits to the man of God, to Elisha. 20 loaves of barley and fresh ears of grain in his sack. Elisha said, give it to the people and let them eat. But his servant said, how can I set this before 100 people? It's only 20 loaves. So he repeated, give it to the people and let them eat. For thus says the Lord, they shall eat and have some left. He set it before them, they ate and had some left, according to the word of the Lord. So that's just another example of a biblical miracle story of somebody multiplying bread, right? And when the people would have seen Jesus do this, if they were familiar, as Jews, if they were familiar with the stories and the miracles of Elisha, which they probably would have been, they would have made that connection. They would have been like, oh yeah, remember this like really important prophet and how he made enough bread for 100 people? Well, Jesus is making enough bread for 1,000 plus or 5,000 plus people, right? So it's like the same type of miracle, but bigger, right? And people would have kind of made that connection in their minds. Yeah, so that's definitely another connection. So yeah, I think those were the main ones that I kind of saw here. The reason that I am kind of having us go through and look at these connections to other stories is because so often we kind of forget that the early Christian community that would have been reading these gospel texts and the people that actually put pen to paper to write them would have been doing it not only with the knowledge of all of the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible stories, but also with the knowledge of the things that happened throughout the rest of Jesus' life, right? So even if we're reading in chapter 6 of Mark, the author of Mark knows what happens in chapter 15 and will try to give us some foreshadowing to things, right? So that's why it's so interesting to look at these texts and kind of go, okay, what lines are they drawing back into history, and what lines are they trying to like foreshadow for us? So like a back into history line would be connecting this to manna or connecting this to Elisha's miracle, and a line forward would be like connecting this to the Last Supper and to Jesus' death, right? So it's always interesting to try to place these stories in the midst of the larger arc of Scripture, because it gives us a better sense of like what the people would have been. The people who would have been reading these stories in early Christian communities, they would have been making all these connections, and it would have given them a wider context for understanding things. Amory says the healing of the blind men. Yes, that's definitely one of those stories that that Jesus, I think that's one of the ones that Jesus has that movement of compassion for. The one that I was thinking of was the I think it's the one where Jesus raises the widow's son. Isn't that another one where he has a feeling of compassion, and it's that same like gut-roiling sensation? That was the one that I was thinking of. But yeah, Jesus has that movement of compassion for the people quite a lot. And I love that it's like a gut word. It's like a gut instinct word. Allie says, didn't Elijah also multiply food when he visited the widow? Yes. So here's another confusing thing about people in the Old Testament, is many have similar names. So there's Elisha with an SH and Elijah with a J, two different prophets, but they worked very closely together for a while at least. They overlapped. So both Elijah and Elisha, I believe, multiplied food for widows. So yeah, that was definitely a thing. The multiplying of food happens a lot, which makes sense because it's a basic necessity, right? It's a thing that people need. And the fact that spiritual leaders are providing that is, I think, pretty meaningful. It's not, it's like, gosh, we did a Bible study on James probably a year and a half ago. And there's a verse in James, I think it is, where it says, if you tell a person who's hungry to go away and be sort of spiritually filled, what good are you doing them? Like, they have to eat. And one of the things I love about so many Bible stories is that the writers of the Bible stories get that. They get that people have to eat before they can kind of think about anything else. And Jesus recognizes that in this story, that if people are going to sit around all day listening to him talk, they probably are going to have to eat. So yeah, I appreciate that recognition of the humanity and needs there. Carolyn says, I kind of find it interesting how later in Mark 8, when 4,000 were fed, the disciples were still like, how can this happen? Yes, so there is a couple of chapters later in Mark, there's specifically a mention where Jesus is going to do this miraculous thing, and the disciples, there's like a sidebar moment where the disciples are like, how could you do this miraculous thing? Even though they'd literally just seen Jesus do a miraculous thing 2 chapters earlier. Yeah, so that's in Mark, one of the main characteristics of the Gospel of Mark is that the disciples are kind of dummies. They don't really get what's going on. They're just kind of going with it, which, I mean, to be fair, I don't understand how a person could feed 5,000 plus people with 5 loaves and 2 fish. So like, maybe I'm a dummy too. I don't know. But the disciples seem to be sort of incredulous all the time, which is interesting to me. So I wanna sort of transition us here into our second part, our second reading of this story, and that is in thinking about how this is relevant to our understanding of rest and work, and scarcity and abundance, right? We've kind of talked about these a little bit. We've talked about Jesus saying the disciples need to come away to a deserted place. We've talked about Jesus going to pray. We've talked about the abundance of bread, right? So we've touched on these things, but I want to talk a little bit more about what we can actually learn from this story in our lives. Julia says, do the chapters skip back and forth in time? No, so they go chronologically in time, the stories of what happens. It's just that it's kind of like when you read any book where the people in the story don't know what's going to happen, but the author writing the story knows what's going to happen. And so sometimes the author will give you little hints about what's going to come ahead. But the disciples themselves, like, they did just see Jesus do this miracle, and then 2 chapters later they're like, how can this be? So yeah, no, those are still in sequence. So let's read this through, and we're going to read it through one more time. And this time I want to ask us a couple of questions here. So we've kind of we know where a source of abundance is, right? We see the abundance of the bread and the fish, the abundance of food, right? This time, as we read through the story, I want you to look for places where there might be examples of scarcity, an example of not enough. Where do we see not enough happening, or the fear of not enough happening in this story? It comes in a couple different places, so keep an eye out for places where there is a sense of not enough of something. So I'm going to read the whole thing through again. The apostles gathered around Jesus and told him all that they had done and taught. He said to them, "Come away to a deserted place all by yourselves and rest a while." For many were coming and going, and they had no leisure even to eat. And they went away in the boat to a deserted place by themselves. Now many saw them going and recognized them, and they hurried there on foot from all the towns and arrived ahead of them. As he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion for them, because they were like sheep without a shepherd. And he began to teach them many things. When it grew late, his disciples came to him and said, "This is a deserted place, and the hour is now very late. Send them away so that they may go into the surrounding country and villages and buy something for themselves to eat." But he answered them, "You give them something to eat." They said to him, "Are we to go and buy 200 denarii worth of bread to give them something to eat?" And he said to them, "How many loaves have you? Go and see." When they had found out, they said, 5 and 2 fish. Then he ordered them to get all the people to sit down in groups on the green grass. So they sat down in groups of hundreds and fifties. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and blessed and broke the loaves, and gave them to his disciples to set before the people. And he divided the 2 fish among them all, and all ate and were filled. And they took up 12 baskets full of broken pieces and of the fish. Those who had eaten the loaves numbered 5,000 men. Immediately he made his disciples get into the boat and go on ahead to the other side, to Bethsaida, while he dismissed the crowd. After saying farewell to them, he went up on the mountain to pray. So where do you see scarcity in this story, or the fear of not enough? There's the obvious one, of course, of not enough food. But where are there other places where there are not enough, or there's a fear of not enough? One of the things that jumps out to me immediately is the sense of not enough space. Like, Jesus is like, we got to get away because we're too crowded here. We need some space to spread out and, like, not be in a group of people. So having space to just get away from people, there's a sense of needing that and there not being enough space. So that always jumps out at me. Carolyn says, Jesus and the disciples don't have enough time to rest since the crowd got there before they did. Yeah, right. Allie agrees with that. So they don't have enough time. So there's a sense of not enough space, not enough time, right? So they didn't even have time to eat. It says, no leisure even to eat. And then they get in the boat and they go there, and their people got there before them. So like they didn't even get there and get any time to rest. So that's a problem. Yeah, Julia says not enough rest. Yes, this sense of like they've been doing all these things and they haven't been able to, like, rest requires time, but it also requires other resources as well. So time, space, rest, those are all things. Carolyn says not enough money to buy food. Right, so the disciples say, do you want us to go get, what did they say? 200? 200 denarii worth of bread. A denarii is a day's wages. So 200 days' wages worth of bread. So there's not enough money to buy all that bread, right? So yes, we've got not enough time, not enough space, not enough rest, not enough money. Are there any other places of not enough? Ooh, Allie says, could the people lacking a shepherd also fit in here? Yeah, like not enough leadership, basically. That's definitely something. I hadn't thought of that. I love that. Yeah, there's a lack of leadership, a lack of the people. Jesus has compassion for them because they're like a sheep without a shepherd. This sense of like milling around and not knowing what to do. So maybe a lack of direction is another way of putting that. Yeah, I definitely think that could fit. Are there any other lack things? Carolyn says, I don't know why, but I imagine Peter calling a pizza shop to get a quote of how much money it will cost to feed everyone. Right. Yeah, specifically asked for 200 denarii because that's what he knows the pizza shop will cost. Oh, that's funny. So we've got all of these lacks, right? We've got all of these not enough moments, all these moments of scarcity. Oh, Carolyn, I just noticed that. Carolyn says there's a lack of daylight, right? In verse 35, it says, when it grew late, the disciples said to him, this is a deserted place and the hour is very late. So yeah, even lack of daylight to go get food, right? Like even if they were going to have pizza delivered, it'd be dark by the time I got there, right? So lack of daylight, love that. So we see all these places where there's either a real scarcity or a fear of scarcity, right? Like one of those two things is happening. And for us, it's so easy for us to go into an immediate fear state when we don't have enough of something. When we feel like we don't have enough time, we get anxious and like all worked up because we're trying to do things too fast and then we're likely to make mistakes. When we don't have enough rest, we're tired and we miss things and we feel like we don't have any gas left in the tank to keep going. When we don't have money or the resources we need, then we maybe like can't go to the doctor, right? When we don't have enough daylight and our only place to go right now is outside, that's obnoxious and that can cause some hard feelings if you have to work all day and you don't get to actually go outside when it's daylight. So all these things can cause distress for us, this either fear of lack of something or real lack of something. And in this story, at the sort of towards the end of the story, we get Jesus providing an abundance of something, providing an abundance of food, which seems to be the food seems to be kind of it's one of the like base things that the people need, right? Like the base things, when we were kind of laying out those examples of not enough sort of leadership or direction, and then not enough food are the two things that the people need, right? And so Jesus provides both those things. He provides leadership and direction, and he provides food. The things that the disciples need are rest and space and time, right? The disciples need all those things. And so Jesus is trying to make that work for them. And so the part of the reason why I added those last two verses in our reading tonight, verse 45 and 46, is to notice that Jesus intentionally makes sure that the disciples get that rest that he promised them. Because like I think it was Carolyn said, that in this story, Jesus like tries to get the disciples away to get them some rest, and then the people are there by the time they show up, so they have to feed everybody. But at the end of the story, in verse 45, it says, immediately he made his disciples get in the boat and go on ahead to another side while he dismissed the crowd. And then he says farewell, and then he goes up on a mountain to pray. So Jesus not only gives the people the leadership and direction and the food that they need, Jesus gives the disciples the rest and the space that they need by making sure that they can get out first and like get out on the boat and get away for some rest while he takes care of the crowd. And then even Jesus needs rest, right? At the end, Jesus is like, okay, I've dismissed the crowd and now I'm going to go up on a mountain to get some time and some space and some rest, right? So all those things, Jesus is kind of providing all of the things in response to the fears of scarcity. And he provides it, he provides so much more than the people expect in so many of those places. Amory says, the importance of Sabbath rest, the fourth commandment, remember to keep it holy. 6 days you are to labor and do all your work, but on the seventh day is the day to rest. Yeah. So throughout Scripture, we see a real emphasis on this idea of the necessity of rest, right? And I really love that we see that happening here, that the people get to recline on the green grass with their shepherd, that they get to rest and eat. We see the disciples getting to finally rest after being shunted away in their boat at the end of the story. And we get Jesus getting to rest up on the mountain while he prays. So all the people in this story recognize that necessity of rest. And it doesn't even say that it's the Sabbath, right? Like this is possibly rest during the week that they're doing here. But it's necessary because they've been doing big work. They've been doing big stuff. So another question I have for us here is, where do these, like Jesus sort of, I guess maybe this isn't so much a question as it is a statement, one of those, that I think it's important to recognize that even though Jesus is the one that multiplies the fish and the loaves, and Jesus is the one who does that miracle of like feeding everybody, he does ask for people's engagement in the miracle by asking the disciples to gather food, and the disciples then asking the people to give up their one loaf or their one fish or whatever. And I think that's important for us to think about, that like Jesus theoretically could have just sort of, made bread out of stones, right? Jesus could have done whatever he wanted to. But instead of just magically making food out of thin air, Jesus asked for the people's involvement in the miracle. So in some people interpret this text as not as much a miracle like creating more food, but more as like a miracle of sharing. Like maybe there was more food than just the 5 loaves and 2 fish, and it was the sharing that allowed everybody to eat. But other people do see it as like a true miracle of like creating more food out of just those 5 loaves and 2 fish. And if that is the case, it couldn't have been done without those people being willing to share, right? In either case, either way you want to read the story, you need to have people's generosity in order to allow for the abundance. So the reason I bring that up is because so often what happens for us is we feel a sense of scarcity, there's not enough, and then we go, okay, I have to keep everything to myself because there's not enough, right? And if we do that, we don't allow for there to be abundance. Because if the people who had the 5 loaves and 2 fish just said, well, I only have this much and there's not enough and I'm just going to hold it, there never would have been enough to be multiplied. Like there wouldn't have been anything for Jesus to multiply, is what I'm trying to say. So those people had to trust in Jesus' ability to make something in order to be open enough and generous enough to give what they had. Does that make sense? The point here being, if we believe that abundance is possible, we can allow ourselves to be more open and generous. And if we are more open and generous, it allows for abundance to happen. So it's kind of this circular thing, right? And I think that's important for us to think about when we think about rest. I'm kind of tying it all together here. That sometimes we feel so harried and so busy and we have so many things to do that we think I cannot possibly stop because there's not enough time. But then when we do stop, it actually allows space for us to do things more thoughtfully, more accurately, more efficiently. and that wouldn't have happened if we didn't allow for the rest in the first place. So this whole idea of like abundance and scarcity, it's like if you lean into whichever one you're leaning into, it gets like it's self-fulfilling. You lean into the sense of scarcity and things become more scarce because everybody gets like all tight about what they have. If you lean into abundance, whether that's about time or money or rest or space or whatever, that usually will help other people also lean into abundance, and then you all have more, right? So that's kind of, I think, what this story is all about, this idea of like allowing and trusting in God's ability to make things abundant when all we see is the scarcity. So there's my little sermon for the moment. Allie says, I remember a place where I read that God likes for us to share in the miracles of creation. Like with transitioning, for example, we are partaking in creating. Definitely. Yes, this idea of Jesus asking the disciples to ask the people to be involved in the miracle is just like totally in line with this idea throughout Scripture of God asking people to be involved in creation, which I 100% connect to transition. I love that. Yeah, people partook in the miracle of creating by sharing the original 5 loaves and 2 fish. Exactly. So how can we partake in that creation by trusting that there will be enough? Trusting that there will be enough time to rest. For me, that's very difficult. Trusting that there will be enough food. And that, especially if you are somebody who grew up dealing with food scarcity, that can be a really instinctually sort of terrifying. Trusting that there will be enough food. And by that I don't mean thinking that food is just going to fall out of the sky. I'm not saying that manna is going to start raining down on you. But what I mean is, in the moments when we go, I don't have enough of that thing, maybe I should clench it closer to myself and not let anybody take it or see it, right? What if in that moment instead we said, okay, I'm worried there's not going to be enough of this, or there isn't enough of this, and I'm going to express that worry to God and also to the other people sitting in my community, the other people I'm sitting with on the green grass, because that allows for somebody else to be generous, and that's also a gift, right? So the sort of trusting in abundance or trusting that there is enough isn't just about sitting alone all by yourself in the room and saying there's going to be enough. It's about expressing the things that you need in community, because that is how we can help each other get the things that we need. That's how we can help each other see the miracles that we might not see, and that's how we can help each other get enough. So we can trust in abundance in community. It's way harder to trust in abundance all by yourself. So trusting it in community seems to work a lot better. Julia says, what about enough safety? Oh, that's such a good question, Julia. I feel like that question about like, what if you have a fear of there not being enough safety? That can be a hard thing to ask for in community because the community might not be a safe one, right? So I think when it comes to that, we have to, number one, kind of go to God and say, like, I'm concerned about this lack of spaces where I feel safe. And number two, find the people who are, how do I explain this? Held accountable enough to be safe. What I mean by that is, for instance, if you go to a licensed therapist, they are accountable to review boards and their licensing boards and other places that help keep them accountable, which means that they are more likely to be a safe person. So you can kind of start out with people that you that are more likely to be safe. That's a hard thing for us to figure out which people in our community can be safe. I think it takes time, but you have to sort of build that up safely, slowly, to find sort of one person that feels safe and then another person that feels safe until you have a whole community that feels kind of safer for you to be in. But that's a hard question, and I'm glad that you asked that because it's something that we all need to be thinking about. How can we create safe communities in order to have safe places to express these needs. So that's definitely important. I want to ask sort of one of the final questions about this text here, and that is, how does love change what is possible in this text? Because we have this sense of like the impossibility of all of these things that are lacking, right? And to me, when I read this text, I see love being the thing that changes that. So for instance, we see Jesus' compassion, Jesus' love for the people, changing the people's fear of not having leadership, fear of not having the food that they need, right? Jesus' love for them changes that. Jesus' love for the disciples means that he knows that they need rest, and it means that he's going to help them find rest, right? So love changes that for them. In all these places in this story, it's love, compassion, care, generosity, all of these facets of love that change lack to abundance. So it makes me think, it makes me wonder sort of how can we allow that to happen in our lives for us? And two, how can we allow ourselves to feel a love that changes things? Let me see if I can restate that in a way that's a little bit better. If we are called to be sort of in these co-creation positions with God, right? In transition, in putting forward the loaf of bread that we have, like all these moments where we are co-working with God to do a cool thing, those are moments when we are being called into a love that transforms stuff. So when do we feel that? How can we contribute to that? How can we contribute to the love that transforms things? And I think that's a question that is going to have a completely different answer for each of us. I'm not asking for you to have an answer to it right now, because I think we all have different ways to make that happen. Bringing it back to Labor Day, the folks that have worked in labor and labor unions for, however long from the beginning of unions, have worked, and we celebrate them on May Day and on Labor Day, both. This idea that they worked really hard to make sure that people had time for rest, that made sure people that had fair wages, which meant they could buy food, right? That made sure that people had the agency over their own certain parts of their life. And so we can see people's love for their neighbor working through those labor movements to make abundance for people who came after, right? So it's something that I think we're all going to have different answers to. We're all going to have a different answer for how do I do this co-working thing with God? What am I called to bring forward? How can I allow love to transform scarcity into abundance? But I hope that's something that you will sort of file away in your brain to think about. I know it's something that I'm going to continue to think about. And that doesn't mean always, I don't want that to sound like, here's another work item for you, because this story is very much still about rest, and about needing rest, and about trying to figure out how to balance that. So maybe I'll just leave us with that sort of question. How can we contribute to the movement from scarcity to abundance? How do we trust in abundance? How do we be open and honest with our communities about what we don't have enough of? And how can we acknowledge when we haven't had enough rest? How can we acknowledge when we need that? Because we all do. So let's hold those questions together, and I think that's where I'll end us tonight. Thanks, everybody, for being here. It was so good to talk with you all. Oh, it was good to see you, Nikki. I'm glad you were here. And I hope you all have a good last night of your hopefully long weekend, or last night of your first day of the week, wherever you are. It's been great to talk with you. We're going to be back here as usual in 2 weeks, 2 Mondays from now. So that'll be on the 21st. The 21st will be our next Bible study. And in the meantime, if you want to catch up with what we're doing over at Transmission Ministry Collective, you can check out our website. We've got all kinds of information there about stuff that's going on, including our support groups that happen twice a week. So if you are a trans or gender expansive person and you want to get into those, come hang out with us. It's a good time. And I think that's all for announcements. So thank you all for being here, and I hope you have a great rest of your night. Bye, everybody.